Hello, my name is Jacqueline Granado, and I'm going to be presenting on the attack on Pearl Harbor as an intelligence failure. On December 7th, 1941, radios buzzed with news that several hundred Japanese planes attacked a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than 2,000 Americans and destroying 8 battleships and over 300 airplanes. It would take some time for people to understand the full scope of the damage committed, and within a few days, a once-distanced war in Europe and the Pacific became a central part of the life in the United States. Following that day, on December 8, 1941, at 4:10 p.m., President Roosevelt signed the U.S. Congress joint resolution that officially declared war on Japan. So to better understand what led to this surprise attack is to understand the biases and mindsets that led to this mistake happening, which I will go into further later. As the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, as we know, Japan and the United States had, however, been edging towards war for decades. The United States at the time was unhappy with Japan's increasingly belligerent attitude towards China. The Japanese government, however, believed that the only way to solve its economic and demographic shortcomings was to expand into its neighbors' territories and take over its import market. So, Japan ultimately declared war on China in 1937, which resulted in the Nanking Massacre and other atrocities. To combat this aggression, American officials placed economic sanctions and trade embargoes. This was believed that without any access to money and goods, especially essential supplies like oil, Japan would have to rein in its expansionism. However, these sanctions made the Japanese more determined to stand their ground. During the months of negotiations between Tokyo and Washington, D.C., neither side would budge. It seemed that war was inevitable. In the coming months, the United States believed a Japanese attack would occur near a South Pacific European colony, whether that was the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, or Indochina. American military leaders were not expecting an attack so close to home. The naval facilities at Pearl Harbor were relatively undefended, so the Japanese Pearl Harbor was an irresistibly easy target. The Japanese plan was simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet. That way, the Americans could not fight back as Japan's armed forces spread across the South Pacific. After months of planning and practice, the Japanese launched their attack. At about 8 a.m., Japanese planes filled the sky over Pearl Harbor. Bombs and bullets rained onto vessels, and at 8:10, an 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona and launched in her forward ammunition magazine. The ship exploded and sank with more than 1,000 men trapped inside. Shortly after, torpedoes pierced the shell of the battleship USS Oklahoma. With 400 sailors aboard, Oklahoma lost her balance, rolled onto her side, and slipped underwater. Less than 2 hours later, the surprise attack was over, and every battleship in Pearl Harbor, including Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, Utah, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Nevada, had sustained significant damage. But it is important to remember that there were 3 tactical warnings before the attack that the Japanese were coming. First, the Japanese launched 2 cruiser float scout planes ahead of the main strike to determine the readiness of American defenses. Radar duty picked up 2 unidentified aircraft at about 6:45 a.m. Nothing happened, and the attack slowly started to come at 8 a.m. Second, at about 3:20 a.m., the minesweeper USS Condor was approaching the harbor entrance and reported sighting a Japanese submarine. These submarines were tasked to penetrate the harbor and attack battleships. After a search, the contact was dismissed, and Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge returned to sleep. At about 6:30 a.m., an alert came in that a small submarine was getting closer and closer. The lookout alerted Outerbridge, and Lieutenant Outerbridge's initial reaction was actually to administer a lesson in naval protocol that junior officers refrain from ordering captains to do anything. Third, two junior men were about to set off on their set that was scheduled at 7 a.m. At 7:02, they saw a massive echo return and the radio spiked like they'd never seen before. The pair reported their discovery at 7:15 a.m. to their superior, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. Lieutenant Tyler was not a regular controller and slowly recalled that a flight of B-17s were due in the morning, so they were believed to be coming. So he remembered. However, Tyler failed to see that there were actually two tracks happening at the same time. They just happened to be close to one another. One was the US and one was the Japanese. Throughout this retelling, we see the biases and mindsets discussed in the intelligence sector. The most prominent is the overconfidence bias. There were several signs that the Japanese were to attack, but they were ignored. You also see it when a lookout tells their superiors to come out to see what is happening, and refers to naval protocols. The lookout was just doing their job, but the lieutenant believed that they were right. Another one is a third example where the superiors, despite not being controller, had gone to the training, keep that in mind, and believed he saw nothing, despite the junior members claiming that they have never seen a radio spike the way that it did. And Tyler ultimately went off the information that he knew, failing to realize what was actually happening. It is also important to note that within our classes, we talked about critical thinking. We talked about there are shortcomings to critical thinking that a lot of people don't engage in. One is not being honest with themselves, like Lieutenant Outerbridge. They weren't skeptical about the constant Japanese submarines and what was happening. They weren't curious, and a lot of it was egocentrism, which are barriers to critical thinking. One also important thing to note is logic is very important in critical thinking. So as they were continuously seeing signs that the Japanese were going to attack, nothing happened. Because of this intelligence failure, the War Power Act of 1941 came into commence. This gave the president enormous authority to execute World War II efficiently. This allowed him to reorganize the executive branch, independent agencies, and government corporations for the war cause. This allowed a lot of power to him. So in the end, intelligence failures teach us a lot. The attack on Pearl Harbor showed that we are never too confident in our surroundings and that the unthinkable can happen. We use intelligence agencies to prevent something like this from happening again. Whether that is through critical thinking, whether that is through logic, whether that is forgetting about your own biases and mindsets, it is important to remember that anything is possible. And also to imagine the worst could prevent us from the reality of it happening again. Thank you. And here are my references.